For 37 years, this man evaded justice for Scotland's most notorious unsolved double murder. Until today. Finally, an end to the saga of the World's End murders. Angus Sinclair has been found guilty and faces the rest of his life in prison.
We have waited 37 years for justice. Today, that wait has ended. We finally have justice for Helen and Christine.
The rape and murder of 17-year-olds Helen Scott and Christine Eadie in 1977 shocked the nation.
I sit at nights and I think, well, just what did she go through? How did she suffer?
3 generations of police officers worked the investigation, which spanned 5 decades.
It was so important to try and try and try again, and when we failed, to keep trying.
The World's End case became a stain on the Scottish legal system after a disastrous failed attempt to prosecute Sinclair in 2007.
There was a just huge disappointment, and I think there was a feeling that justice had not been served.
This is the story of the World's End murders and the man behind them. Angus Sinclair, believed to be one of Scotland's most prolific serial killers. For the police, prosecutors, friends, and especially for the families, this result was a long time coming.
Family, it'll never be closure for me, because I saw Helen that night when she was brought up from East Lothian, and I'll never forget, as long as I live, what I saw that day, what they had done to my beautiful daughter.
The jailing of Angus Sinclair for the murders of Helen Scott and Christine Eadie brings to an end a story which has fascinated and appalled Scotland. In 2007, police had Sinclair in their sights, but a bungled prosecution saw him acquitted, and as the law stood, he could never again face trial for their murders. Tonight, you'll hear the inside story of how this was turned around.
The World's End murders were not Angus Sinclair's only crimes. Today's convictions mean he's been found guilty of a total of 4 murders, but he's suspected of many more. I've investigated the life and crimes of Sinclair for the BBC, and I revealed 5 years ago how he'd managed to evade the law for almost 2 decades whilst wreaking havoc across Scotland. Tonight, I'll be looking back at my original investigation and will show how justice finally caught up with the World's End murderer.
Saturday, October 15th, 1977. 4 friends were off for an evening out. They visited various pubs, but ended up at the World's End on Edinburgh's Royal Mile.
What can I get you?
Christine Eadie and Helen Scott had no idea of the fate that awaited them that night. Tom Wood was a young detective at the time.
Young women, but really teenage girls, go out for the night, and they start, as was common in that time, to go out to see what the action was like in a number of pubs in and around the high street. Arriving here mid to late evening.
Around 200 people came and went from the pub that night, and many were familiar to the girls. But witnesses later told police of 2 men whom no one knew, and who were interested in Helen and Christine.
These were 2 complete strangers, 2 people who nobody recognised. And they were variously described, but they were obviously out-of-towners.
The 2 other girls decided to go on to an impromptu party.
Now, by that time, they were getting on well with the 2 guys, and a decision was made that no, they wouldn't go to the party, they would stay with their newfound friends. It was a critical decision, obviously, and the decision probably led to the end of their lives.
According to statements, the girls were spotted leaving the pub around 11, accompanied at a distance by the two older men. These men would later become the prime suspects. Helen and Christine were never seen alive again. When Helen didn't arrive home as expected, her parents were worried. It was totally out of character.
I don't think she'd been out for 2 or 3 weeks, you know. We were up quite late, and I said, oh, she'll have gone to somebody's house or something. And I went up to bed. I didn't really sleep, but her mum says, oh, I'll wait up, you know. And in fact, her mum stayed up most of the night.
But the families wouldn't wait long for news.
Christine was discovered about 2 o'clock. There was a couple out walking along the coast here. She was found naked in this instance, clothing totally removed, lying on her back, just down from the road, say about 10 yards down from the roadway. She was bound and gagged with items of her own clothing, her tights and her pants, and ultimately we would find out that she'd been strangled with items of her own garments as well. Quite a tragic scene, actually.
Meanwhile, Helen's anxious parents were still waiting for her to walk through the door. Then they heard.
Something came over the radio at 4 o'clock that a body had been found. And then we heard later on that another one had been found down East Lothian. And it was then, just after that, we got a phone call from the police that said we'd like to look at a coat. And right away it was Helen's coat. It was the new one she'd just bought.
The sight of Helen's coat signalled the beginning of the nightmare for Moraine Scott and his family. But ironically, years later, it would be this coat that would lead police directly to the prime suspect.
And this area here, the space in the wall, that's the area where we've got a line of sight into where Helen was deposited. About 30, 40 yards within their line, face down, on the ground. Her hands had been tied behind her back by parts of her own clothing, and there were also ligatures around her neck, again items from her own clothing, belt and tights and the like. And ultimately she had been strangled by these, fashioned items out of her own clothing.
The World's End killings would be one of Britain's longest-running manhunts. It would be almost 30 years before this photo fit was identified as Angus Robertson Sinclair. He became the prime suspect in World's End.
I've uncovered a psychiatrist's report about Sinclair. It says, "He is obsessed by sex. I do not think that any form of psychotherapy is likely to benefit his condition, and he will constitute a danger from now onwards." But this wasn't written after the World's End murders. It was written when he was just a boy, and its chilling warnings would not be heeded. Sinclair was born in 1945, the youngest of 3 siblings. His elder brother John has never spoken publicly about Angus before. He's asked not to be identified because he doesn't want his grandchildren knowing who they are related to.
He roamed about at that time. There was no really parental, when my father died, there was no parental control really to him. It wasn't a case of him getting into bad company, I think he was a bad company.
In 1961, here in this Glasgow street where Sinclair used to live, he carried out his first sex attack on an 8-year-old girl. He was put on probation, but that would be no deterrent because he was on an offending pattern which he would stick to throughout his adult life. And just 6 months later,
he would kill for the first time.
Angus Sinclair had been a neighbour of Catherine Rehill and had sent her on an errand to get a message for him or to get something for him. And when she came back to the house, he had attacked her sexually, assaulted her. During the actual commission of the crime, the door knocker had gone, and Angus Sinclair had had the presence of mind to answer the door, fob off whoever was at the door, and return to the offence. Remarkably cool, remarkably organised for a boy.
How did Sinclair actually kill this little girl?
Strangulation and blunt force.
He gave a false alibi and even pretended to help the investigation, but very quickly he emerged as the only suspect. Detectives couldn't get him to confess to Catherine's rape and murder, so they turned to John.
He just clammed up, and I looked up and I says, look, if he's done it, I says, admit it. And it took me about half an hour, I think, to get him to admit it. He wasn't crying or anything, didn't seem to be all that alarmed about being caught. No, just as if nothing had happened, really.
He didn't seem remorseful at all?
No, he didn't, no. He was a cold wee boy, really. A cold wee boy.
He had proved himself to be cold and calculating. The ligature he used to strangle Catherine was a bicycle inner tube. Remember the psychiatrist's report? It went on to say, given the minimum of opportunity, he will repeat these offences, irrespective of what promises he may give to the contrary. The warning signs were all there. Sinclair was given 10 years for killing Catherine, but served just 7. Whilst in prison, he learned painting and decorating skills, and on his release in 1967, he soon found a job. His work records show that Sinclair was a good employee. He got married about that time. He also had a child, so to many, he seemed like a reformed character. But it was all a big deception, because he was leading a double life. In 1977, a series of murders took place in central Scotland. The first in the sequence was Frances Barker. She was last seen drinking with friends in Glasgow's Maryhill Road. Her body was found 2 weeks later, dumped on wasteland. She had been strangled. Police documents reveal Sinclair had lived in this very street, and he was known to pick up women here. Next, Anna Kenney. Like Frances, she had spent the evening in the pub. She was last seen trying to get a taxi in Townhead, Glasgow. It would be almost 2 years before her remains were discovered in a shallow grave in Argyll, near to where Sinclair spent his honeymoon. Third in the sequence was Hilda Macaulay. She was murdered just 2 weeks before the World's End teenagers, Helen and Christine. 2 months on, there was another victim. Agnes Cooney was a trainee nurse. In December, her body was found on moorland near Airdrie, but she had been stabbed in the neck. So within a 7-month period in 1977, 6 young women had been brutally murdered.
All had been bound and gagged, mostly with items from their own clothing. All of the killings appear to have a sexual motive, and all of the bodies had been dumped, like pieces of rubbish, on remote areas of farmland or on waste ground.
This suggests these murders were linked, but I needed to talk to an expert. The FBI's elite behavioural analysis unit in Quantico, Virginia, was made famous by the film Silence of the Lambs. Former Special Agent Mark Safaric spent more than 20 years as a criminal profiler specialising in sexually motivated murders.
You have really a relatively small geographic area. You have Glasgow and you have Edinburgh, and you have a relatively short time frame. You have 6 months, from June through December of 1977. On its surface, you might say, well, there's a good chance, if you knew nothing about the cases, that they might be linked to one another, especially when you have 4 of the victims disappearing from Glasgow.
It might seem obvious to the FBI, but back in 1977, policing methods were more primitive and the crimes hadn't been connected. Agnes Cooney, the last victim in the sequence, had battled bravely for her life, and Safarik believes this could have been significant.
She stabbed in the neck, so the area that the offender has focused on in the past, the neck, is still the focus here. She stabbed the neck. She has other injuries, other incised injuries that suggest that she was a fighter. She fought back. That may have been very different for this offender. He didn't have fighters in the past.
He told me that this type of incident can lead to offenders picking softer targets.
I think children are much more vulnerable, and they present an easy target population. And as offenders get older, sometimes they just aren't physically in a position to continue with the crimes.
If Mark Safarik is right, then Angus Sinclair's spate of crimes from 1978, when the murders seemed to cease, could be extremely significant. Sinclair had started raping and indecently assaulting children across Glasgow. His technique was simple and similar to how he lured 8-year-old Catherine Rehill to her death all those years ago. He'd ask a youngster to run an errand or help him look for something in a tenement close, then follow them inside before pouncing. One victim remembered her attacker had flecks of paint in his hair. That clue eventually led detectives to decorator Sinclair. Sinclair pleaded guilty to 3 rapes and 7 indecent assaults. He was again examined by psychiatrists who concluded that he represented a permanent menace to children. He was sent to Peterhead Prison. Whilst there, he gave a DNA sample for inclusion in the new National DNA Database. In 2001, that sample linked him to another unsolved murder from years before. Mary Gallagher was a naive and petite 17-year-old machinist from a tight-knit family in Glasgow. She had taken a shortcut on her way to meet a friend in November 1978, just a year after World's End.
And I believe she was taken from here, or possibly the bridge, but certainly down here to 50 yards or so. And that's where Mary's body was found, just at the side of the wall. Mary would have died very quickly. So mercifully, we just hope she wouldn't have known an awful lot about it.
Mary had been violently raped and her throat had been cut. The killer left one of his classic calling cards, a ligature, fashioned from her own trousers, wrapped around her neck. Strathclyde Police launched a full cold case review in 1998. Brian Murphy's team doggedly pursued leads, but it would be DNA evidence that would put Angus Sinclair right at the scene of the crime.
There was something on the pubic hair, so our own lab in Strathclyde Police looked at the sample, and they established there was actually semen on the sample. We got a semen sample, we were able to DNA profile the sample, and when we checked on the DNA database, it was identified as Angus Sinclair.
This wouldn't be the only time his DNA would be recovered from a dead girl. Now it was time to confront Sinclair. And how did he react?
He wilted. He literally physically wilted in front of me. He staggered, and he kind of lost his feet for a second or two. But he composed himself quite quickly. But there was certainly a shock factor, undoubtedly.
But he denied it, and the case went to court. The final insult for the Gallaghers was Sinclair's claim that his DNA was on Mary because they'd had consensual sex, a defence he would use again in later years. But the jury was having none of it. For the first time in his adult life, he was put away for murder.
DNA had proved the key in the Mary Gallagher case, but could it unlock any of the other unsolved murders? Well, in 2004, detectives got the break they'd been waiting for. Another DNA discovery would prompt police to launch a final assault on the World's End. This Operation Trinity would also look at the Glasgow cases, and for the very first time, all 6 were being treated as connected. After almost 30 years, detectives had finally identified a suspect, and they were closing in.
For the first time, we have a positive line of inquiry and have some indications that a number of murders committed throughout Scotland during the late 1970s may be connected.
Operation Trinity, led by Tom Wood, was the largest historical investigation of its kind and involved Strathclyde and Lothian Borders. Tenacious police work and cutting-edge science was about to unlock the mystery of World's End. The coat used to identify Helen all those years ago was finally giving up its secrets.
We found there was a patch on Helen's coat which was saturated in materials which we thought were perhaps secretions of semen. So obviously we looked at them very carefully and used them very sparingly. We hoped that if we just took our time and judged our intervention carefully, science might intersect with what we had.
And that's exactly what happened. For the first time, scientists were able to identify 2 male profiles which they believed belonged to the 2 men who'd been in the pub with the girls all those years ago.
So when we put the second sample, the one that we just discovered, on the database, bang, got a match straight away. Angus Robertson Sinclair, the man we've been looking for since 1977.
Despite usually working alone, it was clear that on this occasion Sinclair had an accomplice. Some ingenious detective work would later identify him as Gordon Hamilton, Sinclair's brother-in-law. But he had died in 1996 from alcohol abuse. The police asked the FBI's Mark Safaric to profile all of the cases. He said it was likely all 6 murders had been committed by the same person. But another man had already been convicted of murdering Francis Barker, which complicated things. And also, crucially, all of the forensic evidence from the other Glasgow cases had been lost. In the end, prosecutors decided against the Glasgow cases and went all out for World's End.
A man has been formally charged with the notorious World's End murders in Edinburgh 29 years ago.
Sinclair claimed his semen was on the girls because they'd had consensual sex. And he claimed they'd both been murdered by his now dead brother-in-law, Gordon Hamilton. But in a controversial twist, prosecutors decided not to use evidence that Sinclair's DNA was on the ligatures used to strangle the girls. The case collapsed, and Sinclair was acquitted. After a 30-year wait, the trial was over in just 2 weeks.
Words can't explain how I feel. 30 years of trying to get a conclusion. I promised to my late wife that I would stick by this and get somebody brought and get justice, which honestly I don't think I've had today. Had it gone, at least had it gone to a jury, one can accept probably their decision.
It's probably one of the saddest days of my life, actually, you know. Because I was aware of people in the background, I was aware of Maureen and Margaret, the parents, the girls. And I was aware of the efforts of all the police officers that had ever worked in the past in relation to it.
The collapse of the 2007 trial looked like the end of the line. As the law stood, Sinclair could never be retried. But the final revelation in our programme 5 years ago was that the SNP government planned to scrap the law of double jeopardy, which prevented anyone from being tried twice for the same crime. That opened the way for a fresh prosecution. But for that to happen, new evidence would have to be found.
Alan Jones never gave up looking for that evidence. And just months before retiring from the police, he found a company which had developed new technology for looking at old DNA.
The techniques are incredible. that they could go back to these old ligatures were 37 years old. They could actually pick up the skin cells that were left by individuals handling these ligatures, and by doing that, analyse and target the areas and analyse the DNA that was on these ligatures, and were able to say that the people involved in tying these were the individuals that were Gordon Hamilton and Angus Sinclair.
And this breakthrough was enough to bring Sinclair back to court.
But I always promised my late wife that I would keep at it, and I would never give up, you know, as long as I was alive, that I would try, and I was quite sure family would be the same way if I was away tomorrow, you know, because I think everybody's wanting justice, that's all.
Moraine would face his daughter's killer once more in Scotland's first double jeopardy trial. In a surprise twist, Sinclair decided to give evidence. The families watched as he claimed the girls had willingly had sex with him and that he'd left them alive. But these photos reveal how Sinclair's DNA was embedded in the ligatures used to tie them up. It was the proof prosecutors needed.
It was always there. It was deposited during this appalling murder, or murders. What happened was that the forensic scientists were able to unlock the door as a result of the new techniques that they had available. But yeah, they were able to. That was a huge advance in forensic science, and the scientists should be applauded for their work in this case.
Today, a jury took less than 2.5 hours to find Angus Sinclair guilty.
On both charges 1 and 2 in cumulo, I sentence you to life imprisonment to run from today, and I fix the punishment part at 37 years. Result.
37 years without parole. 37 years. How appropriate.
They've stolen life from 2 youngsters who had their whole life ahead of them. And just on one night they can just take it away. It's wrong.
The World's End murders have been solved, but tonight we've seen evidence that Angus Sinclair could be responsible for at least 4 other murders.
As an individual, he's probably one of the most dangerous people you would ever meet. There's been other serial killers elsewhere in other countries, but in Scotland, no, there's nothing else. Sinclair is by far the worst.
Those who brought Sinclair to justice believe he still has much to answer for.
He's a violent criminal. You know, he committed robberies, extremely violent robberies, a string of sexual offences, very serious sexual offences against young girls, as well as the murders we now know he has committed. And I believe there are probably many, many more crimes that he is responsible for, and we may never know the full extent of his offending.